Good morning, everybody, and my thanks to Matt and colleagues for the invitation to come and speak here today. And I think some of you may have heard me speak a little bit last night, so today is the visual side of things, a bit more practical details. And this is my third trip to Ireland. I've been here twice before, so I know a little bit about the island. Obviously nothing like as much as all of you do, but I've got a few pictures that show some comparisons between Scotland and Ireland to show that our situations are pretty similar in many ways, and I hope that what I'm going to show you about what's happened in Scotland will help to inspire, the growth of initiatives like Home Tree and other similar ones here, because that's what the earth needs at the moment. So I'm just going to dive straight into this. I talked about this yesterday, so this is the image I referred to, the planet from space, taken photographed by the Apollo 8 astronauts in 1968, the first time that humans saw our home from a distance. And out of thousands of photographs, it's always this one that's shown because you can see the outline of the continents. They're recognizable. In many of them, it's mostly cloud cover. But here you can see Africa, you can see Madagascar over here, there's even Antarctica down at the bottom, the Arabian Peninsula, and a little bit of Europe right up at the very top. And like many people, I think when I first saw this photograph, it's like, wow, it's beautiful. The only place that we know that supports life at the moment. But actually, after a few years, I realized the prominent feature here is the red color. It's the deserts. And of course, deserts are natural ecosystems on the planet, but most of what's in this photograph is desertified landscapes, areas that have been degraded historically by people. And we know that because Western civilization is said to have begun up in this area here. And civilizations do not begin in deserts. They begin in the fertile, richest areas. And in this case, it was the Fertile Crescent, which is Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq and Iran. And my wife is actually half Iranian. She comes from that area, and I've been to visit it. And it's mostly desert today. It wasn't that way originally. So this, to me, is the planet's call for help. This is the sign that, things need to change. So moving into that in more practical details, this is the need for change in Scotland. This is what Sir Frank Fraser-Darling, a famous British conservationist in the 1950s, termed the wet desert. It's not sandy and dry and arid, but biologically it's just as much a desert as those sandy areas in the previous photograph. This is the upper watershed of Glen Affric in Scotland, where much of the early work of Trees for Life took place. And you can see here virtually treeless landscape in the background, and this is what we call a peat hag. I don't know if you have a similar term for things here in Ireland, but where erosion has taken place and trampling, particularly of deer here, prevents the regrowth even of any plants that would survive there. And you can see the exposed stumps of the pine forest that flourished here in the past. Those stumps in some cases have been dated to 4,000 years old. The peat acts as an actual preservative, but in other cases they're much more recent. If they're sticking up through the peat, they can be just 100 or 200 years old. So that's Scotland. This is from one of my previous trips to Ireland, and this is, I'm looking at here, I can't remember the name, Barfinny Lake in County Kerry, so I'm not sure how far that is from here, but it's very similar, and you can see there's just a bit of vegetation on the island there, and otherwise it's a treeless landscape. So the British Isles have suffered, both mainland Britain and Ireland, the island of Ireland, have suffered from exploitation for a long time. So the Highlands in Scotland are a depleted landscape, and here's another peat hag. This is a stump here that is sticking up above the vegetation, so that was one that was probably alive 200 years ago, and this is what we've got in many places today. These are taken a few miles apart. This tree would have been alive 100 years ago. The thing about Scots pine is that it naturally has a lot of resin in its trunk, and when the tree dies, the wind will take off the needles and the small branches and twigs, but the main stem can persist for decades because of the resin content. It's very slow to rot and to decompose. So this is a sort of a sentinel, a reminder of what's happened there in the past, that there used to be forest. Probably 100 years ago there would have been more trees there. So again, more of the same. There's lots of areas like this, but it's not just the stumps, it's also the remains of people used to live in this landscape. There's a ruined house there. Somebody would have been living there, 200 or 300 years ago, probably before the notorious event in our history called the Highland Clearances, which happened after the Battle of Culloden in 1746, when the Highlanders were defeated. Their lands were confiscated and handed to absentee landlords, mostly from England. And at that time, the people were cleared off the land and sheep replaced them. And there's a lot of abandoned houses from that era. And you can see here the ruin of the croft, and these are blocks of peat that have been washed from upstream by the river in times of flood, because there's no trees with their roots to hold it in place anymore. So it's a continuously deteriorating landscape. That's the situation we've inherited from the past. This, by contrast, is what the Highlands should be like. And this is actually the same glen as those previous photographs, but this is several miles further downstream, and there's a much healthier forest there, and you can see there's pines, there's birches, and it's great to be here surrounded by birches, alder, oak, and a few pines. So I'm feeling like the Caledonian forest is present here in this room today, so thank you to Matt and others for thinking of that. And this is what the forest looks like inside. So you've got trees here, you've got blaeberry, which you've got here in Ireland, and this is heather, common heather, ling, we also call it, Calluna vulgaris. So it's a rich, healthy landscape. And if you contrast that with, those skeletal remains that we saw in the previous photographs, it shows the extent, the magnitude of what's been lost. And of course, that's just the vegetation. We've also lost most of our wildlife. So again, a little bit more about the commonalities. This is a place on the west coast of Scotland, Glen Beesdale. It's a special area of conservation, although that may change now that Britain's outside the European Union. That's a European designation. It's a supposedly protected site, but it's being overgrazed by deer. And this is Killarney National Park here in Ireland. So the west coast of Scotland, like much of the west coast of Ireland, had temperate rainforest. And there's tiny pockets of that left in Scotland, as there are here in Ireland today. A beautiful, rich landscape, very different to the pine forest, dominated in both cases by oak and full of mosses, bryophytes, lichens and ferns, rich and green. And just one more comparison here. This is Scotland on the left. This is up in the Scowrie Peninsula, which is further north and on the west coast. And you can see the stony, deforested hills and a few trees surviving on the islands. And this is Killarney. Exactly the same thing, the deforested hills and a couple of wooded islands there. So I'm just emphasizing this point to show that there's a lot of similarities, and therefore a lot of what we've done in Scotland could be replicated here at scale as well, although there's different challenges to do with ownership and so forth. And then finally, another contrast here. I took this photograph just a few weeks ago. This is back on the west coast of Scotland, Rhododendron ponticum inside a pine forest, and you can see it's taken over. And this one here is Killarney, taken a few years ago when I was here. So we've got identical issues to deal with. So just visually then, I don't know if you can all see this at the back, but the shaded area here shows the approximate extent of the Caledonian forest, the native pine woods of Scotland at their maximum, probably about 4,000 years ago. 10,000 years ago, there were no trees in Scotland because the whole country was covered by ice in the last ice age. But when the ice retreated, the trees colonized, and this is the approximate area in the Highlands where pine dominated. There's a big slash down there where you see there's nothing. That's where what we call the Great Glen is. Loch Ness and a couple of other lochs. It's mostly water, so that's why there are never any trees there. And today, these are the remnants, these black spaces here. And this shaded area is the area that I highlighted back about over 30 years ago as the target area for restoration. And I picked that because it's got some of the best remnants of the old forest, and it's a roadless area, and there's virtually nobody living there. There's lots of remnants here. This is the Cairngorms National Park, but there's a much higher population density there. There's lots of roads. There's more commercial forestry. There's skiing industry. So there's much more human pressures. So this area here, was in my view the best place where we could actually get a wild natural forest back that's there just for itself, for its ecological function and as a habitat for species, all the way up to the wolf, the largest of our missing mammals. So the problem we've got with the forest today is it's what I call the geriatric forest. It's old trees like this, and you can see here one living tree surrounded by two snags, standing dead trees. And as I said, once they die like that, they can persist for decades. So we've got old trees, and they're all reaching the end of their lifespan. They're all 200, 250 years old. Scots pines will live longer than that in good conditions. The oldest pine in Scotland was dated at 550 years a few years ago. But the majority of them live to about 200, 250 years. And we've got nothing growing underneath them because of the excessive population of deer. The red deer population, we've also got roe deer, which you've got here, Sika deer, which you've got here, and we've got roe deer, but it's the reds that are the main issue because they're much bigger and they're more hungry, obviously. So their population has more than doubled in the past 40 years. Encouraged by landowners feeding them for so-called sporting purposes, so wealthy people can go and take a pot shot and get the head of a stag and stick it on their wall above their mantelpiece. So deer numbers have increased, and this is what happens. This is a pine seedling, and you can see it's been eaten back repeatedly at the top, and there's just a few needles left. And this actual seedling, I went up a few months after I took this photograph, and it was dead. You know, the last needles had been removed. So that's been happening for 200 years. No trees have been able to grow unless they're on an island or on an isolated rock outcrop. No trees have been able to grow beyond this height. And that means we've got this huge generation gap resulting in the geriatric forest. And just to show you the pressure of overgrazing, this is a particular patch of rowans. I don't know if we've got any rowans here. I don't see any immediately, but they're around, I know, that I've been photographing since 1992. And you can see the surrounding landscape. There's not a single tree in sight. Rowans, as I'm sure you all know, the seeds are dispersed by birds who eat the berries, and the seeds germinate in bird droppings. Birds often perch on little mounds like this. They would perch on trees, but there's no trees, so they use a mound, and that's why this cluster of rowans got established here. And you can see 96, 99, 2004, 2008, 2012, 2015. I'm due for another visit. But you can see by 2015, the cluster was actually smaller than it was back in 1992. It had been repeatedly browsed back. So that's the situation we're faced with. And in a landscape like this, this tree would have no chance because rowan is one of the most palatable of all species for deer. It and aspen are their favourites. They'll eat it before anything else. So there's no possibility for this tree to grow unless it's protected, and deer are kept away from it. So another comparison slide here, but this is not with Ireland, this is with Norway. Some people still question, well, Scotland's too cold, too wet, the soils are too poor, forest won't grow there. Not true. This photograph is Scotland. This is in Ben Damf in Wester Ross, north of Glenafrican on the coast. You can see it's a mostly rocky landscape, very similar to some of the areas in the southwest of Ireland here. And this photograph here was taken on a visit I organised for Trees for Life staff to southwest Norway a few years ago. And we had a man there, a host who was a Scotsman living in Norway for 20 years, and he's specialised in doing comparisons between Norway and Scotland. So this area here, you probably can't read it at the back, but this one latitude 57.49 degrees north, this one 58.50, so it's further north. Annual rainfall in Scotland 2,800 millimetres, annual rainfall in Norway 4,000 millimetres. Average temperature 8.3 and between 4 and 5 in Norway. This area in Norway 100 years ago was as desolate and bleak as this. But what happened in Norway was something different to Scotland. They had a voluntary exodus of people because they had depleted their landscape. And around the turn of the last century, some people from Norway went to the US, and they found out that the American government was encouraging settlement of the Great Lakes area in the Midwest of the States, and they were giving away free parcels of land. So these people from Norway sort of, they wrote letters back to their relatives and family saying, hey, it's much better over here. There's big forests, there's lots of animals and fish in the lakes, and we can live. So there was a mass exodus of people from southwest Norway in the early part of the last century. And unlike Scotland, they were not replaced by sheep because Norway had a different system of land ownership. And deer numbers did not increase either. So the forest in Norway has recovered spontaneously by itself. Nobody planted it, it's grown. These are relatively young trees in the last century. So it shows what's possible. So we can do it in Norway, we can do it in Scotland. So that's what I've been involved with since I started Trees for Life in 1986. And I said yesterday, you know, when I started, I had no knowledge or experience of this. I had no training. I had no access to land. I had no resources. So all of those things have come in the past 30 odd years. So to my mind, there's three main elements needed for a successful restoration project. And I'll go into those in a bit more detail, but just to summarize them here. So the first one is the restoration of healthy vegetation communities, because the vegetation is what supports all other life. Animals, birds, insects, they all need vegetation as the base of the food web. So that's the first and most important thing. And you can see here one of these skeletal dead pines, and this is an area that it was the first project actually that Trees for Life fenced. We put a deer fence up around 50 hectares of land in 1990. So that's, 32 years ago now. And all these young pines here have grown since then. There's still a few living ones in the background with cones, and there's birch has come as well. There's even a holly in there which you probably can't see. So that's all grown spontaneously. So that's the first step. We have to get the vegetation recovering again. We've got to start a new generation of trees and herbaceous plants and ferns and lichens and all those things. They need to recover. And then once we get that, that's the first step in the return of reinstatement of key ecological processes. And some of those are succession. So birch, for example, and rowan are pioneer species. So they are the ones that grow very quickly. They're able to spread quite far. Birch seeds are very light, so they travel a long way in the wind. Rowan berries go in birds' stomachs, and the rowan seeds germinate in very remote areas, as you saw. So they're the first wave, but they're short-lived. They live maybe 100, 120 years. And then we get the slower growing, later successional trees coming in behind. Pine is one of those. In good places of soil, we'll get oak and so forth coming in. So that's the natural process of succession. And then we get nutrient cycling taking place. And at the moment, there's still nutrient loss happening throughout the highlands in most treeless areas, because people feed deer in winter. The deer graze in the landscape, what little vegetation is there. And then when they're shot, their carcasses are extracted and the meat is sold in a butcher shop in a city somewhere. And one deer does not make a big difference, but when you think of thousands of deer for hundreds of years, in an already depleted landscape, that makes a huge difference. And this is one of the other illusions that I think needs to be dispelled. In Scotland, you know, the shooting industry promotes shooting red deer as the monarch of the glen, and there was even a TV series made of that. I don't know if it was shown in Ireland, you know, entitled Monarch of the Glen. And in fact, what they should be called, the deer should be known as the runts of the glen, because red deer in Scotland are about 60% of the size of red deer in Norway, where they have a forest habitat to live in. And they're emaciated, they're small in size because they don't have a healthy diet. You know, there's not a good food source for them. So we need to get nutrient cycling. Natural disturbance, occasional storms or floods, they have a role to play. And in many cases, particularly in the commercial plantation industry, of course, they do their utmost to avoid those things. So we're blocking the natural functioning of an ecosystem. And then the last one I've got up there is predator-prey dynamics. And it's been demonstrated in places like Yellowstone in the US, where wolves have been returned, that they actually, their biggest effect, although they prey on elk, which is what they call deer, it's the same species. I don't know if everybody's aware of that, but Cervus elaphus in North America is much bigger again than in Scotland, because it's got a forest habitat to live in. So the elk are preyed upon by wolves, but a much bigger impact is the wolves keep the animals on the move, so they're not in one place all the time. And that has famously allowed trees along water courses in steep valleys to regenerate, and then that's allowed beavers to return, and it's had this cascade of positive benefits. None of that is happening in Scotland today. I mean, it's this static, paralysed landscape at a bare minimum level of survival. And then the final thing here is the reintroduction of missing species, including large mammals and apex predators. And that's actually been underway for much longer than the work of Trees for Life. We've had successful programs to reintroduce the sea eagle in various parts of Scotland. There's also beavers now there. So it's underway, but we've yet to tackle the bigger issue of the carnivores, the lynx and the wolf. Okay. So reducing herbivore numbers then enables tree regeneration. So going back to that first thing of getting healthy vegetation communities back. And there's two ways of doing that. Something happened there, but it's all right. There's two ways of doing that. I've talked about fencing already. So that's what my charity has been involved with mostly, in the early days at least, because we were working on other people's land. So it was up to them what they would agree to. So fencing gives a good result, but this is the work of just natural regeneration through reducing deer numbers. And this is in an area called Glenfeshie, which is in the Cairngorms National Park, one of the other remnants of the Caledonian Forest. And that was bought by a Danish businessman, must be getting on for 20 years ago now, called Anders Poulsen, who is now the largest landowner in Scotland. He owns about 10 estates. And he took a very radical step of saying, I'm going to reduce the deer numbers down to very low indeed. And in Scotland, the recommended figure to get natural regeneration is between 3 and 5 per square kilometre. 3 or 5 deer per 100 hectares. He's taken his deer numbers down to 1 per square kilometre. So he's really been quite radical, and because he's a wealthy man and a landowner, he's got the ability to do that. He's got control over his area. So you can see the old pines in the background here, and there's literally hundreds of pines here. And if you go to his place now, I haven't got more recent photographs of it, but there's some areas where it's like a carpet. There are so many seedlings getting established, and that's not entirely natural. There should be some browsing taking place, but that's an easier problem to deal with. And this is another example here. This is Craigmeggy National Nature Reserve, which is managed by Scottish Natural Heritage, or Nature Scot. It's just been renamed by the government. And you can see again the result of deer culling, allowing trees, in this case it's mostly birch, it's the pioneer species, to get established. So coming on to the work of Trees for Life then, this is me in 1992. This is what I looked like. And I just, it's funny to say, because in those days, I had no experience of this. And this is on land managed by the Forestry Commission, the government forestry agency in Scotland. And they're the professionals. They're a government body. They're as serious and formal as they can be. And I still think it's a bit of a miracle that they agreed to work with me. This guy who looked like this had no experience. But Glenafric has one of the best remnants of the old forest, and a visionary forester in the 1960s, he fenced off a big area there as an experiment. He didn't know what would happen, and the forest recovered, and I saw that, and I kept thinking, well, why are they not fencing off these other areas? And they had no funding for it. There was a time of budget cuts. This was in the era of the Margaret Thatcher government, so the Conservative government was forcing the Forestry Commission to become, a surplus generating agency rather than one that was funded. So they had a minuscule conservation budget, and I'd raised enough money and had identified this area on the edge of the old woodland. You can see the old trees behind me there. And I went out one day with the district manager, who was a young guy, and I said, look, you've got land and you've got no money to do anything about it. I've got some money and I've raised it to regenerate a forest. Can we get together and form a partnership? And remarkably, he said yes. So 50 hectares was fenced here in 1992. And 1990. I took this photograph in 1992 because by that time the first signs of regeneration were visible. This is what we call a hummock. I don't know if you've got that here in Ireland. It's a sort of mound of vegetation left over from glacial days. Sometimes it's a rock, sometimes it's just soil. And there's blaeberry here. And in 1990 this tree grew that much there. So it was held in check before the fence went up at the height of the blaeberry. And as soon as it stuck its head up above that, it would be eaten. So in 1990, it grew to there. All these needles were 1901's growth, and this was taken in early May, I think. So those buds, candles we call them, for obvious reasons, that was the start of 1992's growth. So that's what that tree looked like. This is the same tree photographed in September last year. And you can see it towers above me now, and I've had to step back a long way I put in a photographic monitoring post about 2 meters from this tree, and of course it's totally useless now. But this tree is, I don't know how big it is now. We measured it when we measured it in 2010, when it was 20 years old, and it was about 30 feet tall then. And it's been coning, so it's been seeding itself, and that's really important since about that time, because young trees are more vigorous and they produce more cones and more fertile seeds than the old ones do. You know, trees are a bit like people, you know. I'm past my reproductive prime now, and you know, quite a few people in this room probably are as well. But these young trees are like, you know, they're teenagers, they're virile, they're ready to go. So that's really good. We've got a new generation of trees growing. But I want to say a little bit about this one. And those of you who heard my talk last night, you know, I talked about this thing about the quality of the heart, and that human love makes a real difference. So this tree, I call it the champion pine, because it's the one that I've been following the longest. And I go out every year and I take a photograph of it, and every group I take out there sees this tree. And Matt, if he's still here, he's been to this tree on the week he did with my wife and I just a month ago or so. So I take lots of people there. Media people have been there. If journalists come to interview me, I take them to this tree. So it gets a lot of attention. It gets a lot of appreciation. It gets a lot of care. Much more so than the others. And there's actually other trees growing around it. So I've been calling it the champion pine, but on the 20th anniversary, I decided, well, we should actually check if this is true. I felt it was the biggest tree there, so I went out with a colleague at Trees for Life using an instrument called a laser hypsometer, which is a sort of little thing like a laser pointer. But it's got computer chips inside it, and you aim it at the top of a tree and you aim it at the bottom of a tree, and it calculates the angle and it tells you the height of the tree. So we measured all the trees around here, and guess what? This was the biggest tree. And we did the same thing after 30 years, so after a couple of years ago, and it's still the biggest tree there. So for me, that's not an accident, that's not a coincidence. It's because this tree gets a lot of appreciation, and you know, you're looking at it and some of you are smiling, and on some level that benefits the tree in my worldview, you know. So thank you for doing that. This is the same area, but not at the fence line. So it's 50 hectares, it's quite big. So you saw the fence in the other one. This is in the heart of the area, and this photograph was taken in 1989, so the year before the fence went up. This was when I was out with the man from the Forestry Commission, and I'd done a casual walk around it, and there were loads of seedlings everywhere. And before the fence went up, we had a student from Edinburgh University contact us and say, I need to do a research project for my degree in forestry. I've heard about your ideas, can I help? So I said, yes, you can come and survey this area. So this man, Paul Blanchflower, came, and he did a series of transects across the whole area where the fence would go up. And his results showed that in the 50 hectares, there was an estimated 100,000 pine seedlings. 100,000 pine seedlings, self-seeded. Average age, because he took some away and sliced them in the lab and counted the tiny rings, average age 9.9 years old. And the average height was 8.5 centimeters. 10-year-old trees that height, because 95% of them had grazing damage. Their leader shoots had been nipped off, their side shoots had been nipped off, and that had been happening for 200 years, giving this result of just the old skeletal remains and a few living trees in the background. So these trees, these snags, as I say, persist for decades, and you can see this is 1989, this is September last year, and that central tree is virtually unchanged in that time. You know, the small twigs and branches are gone, the needles are long gone, the wood has a high resin content, and the other trees, this one you can just about see through there, but they're covered by all the growth of young trees. Nobody planted those are regenerating by themselves. Let nature do most of the work. That's one of the key principles of ecological restoration or rewilding. And there's not just birch, there's rowan and other things. It's not just pine, there's birch and rowan in there as well, although they're not so visible. But also look at what's happening. They're not growing evenly. Some of them are growing at different rates, so it's not going to look like a plantation, which is like a giant carpet of trees that are exactly the same height and have no side branches. This will be a much more natural forest. So that was how we started with natural regeneration, but that's only possible if you've got a seed source nearby and if there's seedlings visible. Much of the highlands, as you've seen, are completely treeless. So we've also been involved in tree planting. Oops, I went too far there. So this was our first time of tree planting. This was in 1991. And here's a stump of an old pine tree. This is not in a peat hag. It's not thousands of years old. That tree would have been alive probably 100 years ago. So again, this is working with the Forestry Commission, and they had actually planned this project out before we got involved with them, but we were able to then step in and work with them and organize volunteer groups to come and plant the trees. So this man is holding up his little pine seedling next to the planting bag there, and he planted the tree virtually where he's standing. So that's 91. This is the same thing in 2002, so 11 years later, that's the tree he planted. And you can see there's other trees, and there's some rowan here regenerating naturally. But what's also really interesting is it's not just the trees have grown, but look, here all these exposed roots of the stump are covered over because heather has grown, there's blaeberries coming in, there's moss, there's blaeberries on top of the stump. None of that was able to grow previously. This is inside a deer fence, so we're actually getting the recovery of the whole vegetation community, not just the planted trees. And this is the same tree photographed a month ago. And you can just about make out the stump is there. It's completely covered by moss now and heather. And the tree is towering over me. So that's after 31 years of protection. No grazing, the planted tree is getting away. And it's getting harder and harder to take comparison photographs of this because there's no skeleton above the ground. There's just that stump hidden away there. But this to me is a more dramatic image of the same area. And this is the fence line. And these are some of the pines that were planted back in 1991. This photograph was taken 23 years later. Here's the fence, but look at the contrast. Outside the fence, we've just got the grass and we've got the peat hags that I showed earlier, where erosion is still occurring. That peat hag extended inside the fence, but has revegetated over. This is bog myrtle. Some of you I'm sure are familiar with bog myrtle, which is a plant that grows in bogs, of course. But what's crucial about it is it fixes nitrogen through bacteria that grow in its roots. So it actually, benefits the soil. It's like a member of the pea family. It's a nitrogen fixer. And it's highly palatable to deer, so there's nothing growing out there. So we've got the bog myrtle improving the soil, we've got the heather in bloom, we've got the trees. And you can see it's actually very simple. Nature responds if we give her a chance. Here's a couple of other images showing the same thing. This is the same area, but it's 60 hectares. The previous photograph was taken over this side. The river is over there. And here's the other side of the fence. And again, you see the same thing outside the fence. There's just a couple of stumps, one remaining birch. There were 2 or 3 birches inside the fence. And look at all this regeneration here. These all occurred naturally, and then there's a few planted pines on the skyline. The heather is flourishing. There's all sorts of other vegetation growing there. And outside it's just the grass. This one, it may not be clear to you at the background. This is, to me, the biggest miracle of all. This is on the headwaters of the Afric watershed, and it's about 5 miles, 8 kilometers further west than this. There were no mature trees there at all, but we found some eared willow seedlings along the banks of the Afric River. So there were just a few scattered ones, so we just put up small areas of fencing like this. This was done by volunteers. The eared willows grew, but what was really remarkable, and I don't know if you can see it, but there's little spots of blue in there. Bluebells started flowering 7 years after the fence went up. How did they get there? I don't know. The nearest bluebells are about 20 kilometers east of there. Were the bluebell bulbs in the soil dormant all that time? Or somehow did they get there? So it was mind-boggling. It's such a miracle in this desolate, bleak landscape. These young trees growing and bluebells flowering. Nature really responds to our love and care. So here you see the process of ecological succession happening. This photograph on the left, another fence. This is on the Upper Africa again. Outside the fence you can just see grass. Inside here you can see the dark brown is heather. So the natural process of succession in these areas is you would get heather coming in amongst the grasses. And grass, of course, is highly evolved to withstand heavy grazing pressure. It sprouts again from the base. Heather, if it gets browsed, just dies back. So as soon as you relieve the grazing pressure, the heather starts to grow. And then in the heather, you get the pioneer trees coming, the birches and rowans and so forth. So that's ecological succession underway. This is the early stage of it here. This is a more developed stage of it. And once the vegetation grows, of course, you get the wildlife returning. So here we've got a caterpillar on the leaf of an alder. This is a crested tit. There's a couple of mating red soldier beetles, and this is a green hair-streaked butterfly. And these were all taken in some of these areas that I've shown you. This one here actually is very interesting. This pine that this bird is sitting in is that tree that I showed that I called the champion pine. And when I was out there with my colleague in 2010, 20 years after the fence went up, with a laser hypsometer, this crested tit appeared and it landed in the champion pine. And I don't know, if you know, but birds like this, they don't have two eyes in the front of their head. They've got one on each side. So when they want to see somebody, they look at you like this, one side, and then they turn and look at you this the other way. That's what he's doing right here. And it was just such a clear message. It was like, thank you. You've given me a home. So we've done nothing for this except allow the vegetation to grow. Everything comes back by itself. And all sorts of interesting things. This is the champion pine again here. This was in September last year. And this is a wood ant nest that has appeared just very close to it. And it's fairly small at the moment. And wood ant nests can be about as high as this, with maybe 500,000 ants in them when they're big. This is quite small, but here are the ants on a pine needle on the nest. And that to me is another symbol of the return of a healthy ecosystem, because wood ants are a keystone species in the invertebrate community, in that ground layer of vegetation. And they milk aphids for their honeydew, and they'll remove defoliating caterpillars from trees and take them back to feed to their young in their nest. So they have a profound influence. And even the peat hags recover with time. So I've talked about them before. You've seen similar pictures to this. And this is inside that area where I showed the peat hag stopping at the edge of the fence. And this is inside that fence. And you can see the stumps that were visible like this before. There's still little bits of them visible, but we've got sphagnum moss, we've got grasses, we've got heather, cross-leaved heath, and lichens growing in there. And the vegetation, it's a slow process because these are very nutrient depleted areas, and it starts with the mosses and things that are slow growing, but they slowly build up an organic humus layer on top of the peat, which eventually allows everything to recover. So one of the other key things we've been involved with, and I know this is happening in Ireland too, is dealing with non-native species. This is rhododendron removal. So we've done quite a bit of work in that. And in Glen Affric, there's a lodge, a big Victorian era mansion, and it's privately owned. And there were lots of rhododendron bushes on the hill, around small hill around it, the mound around it, and they were seeding into the forest. So we've been involved in removing those over a number of years. And it's got a different landowner now, and he took away all the old rhododendrons. So hopefully that problem is finished there. But as you saw from the earlier photograph, the west coast of Scotland is as badly infested as much of the west coast of Ireland is. So this is on the Ben Damf estate, and this is an area of huge rhododendrons, and the landowner there had contractors come in and do what's called stem injection with glyphosate to kill the big rhododendrons, and our volunteers came in afterwards then to cut them down, and the big pieces were used to actually feed the wood stove in the accommodation where the volunteers were staying. So it was a healthy process. Other places, the small ones are just burned like that. So that's important work. It's not just rhododendron. There's other non-native species, and something that's actually happened in Ireland has now been shown to be replicated in Scotland is the return of pine martens actually tipping the balance away from grey squirrels and in favour of the native red squirrel. So that's something where Scotland has actually benefited from the Irish experience. And Emma Sheehy, who I think did the research in Ireland, has repeated that in Scotland. So there's many different non-native species that need to be dealt with. There's some that are being ignored at the moment. Sika deer are being ignored in Scotland, just as I think they're ignored here. That's still to come. So the other thing then is the return of the missing mammals. So we've got 2 of our missing species back in Scotland at the moment. The beaver, which was reintroduced to Knapdale in Argyll about close to 20 years ago now. That was an official programme, and then there was an unofficial one in the Tay catchment, and that's been much more successful because the Argyll ones, it was a safe option, it was a peninsula, and there was no way for them to spread. But in the Tay catchment, it's a big river catchment, so they've spread a lot. So we've got beavers back, although they're not back in Glenafric and the Cairngorms National Park yet. They're still south of the main mountain mass in Scotland. We've just heard that the Cairngorms National Park's next 5-year management plan includes the return of the beavers, so that's going to be great. But it's been hard work. And there's been protests from some farmers and so forth whose fields, arable crops, have been damaged by beaver dams. But it affects a small minority of people, but they have a loud voice, and government tends to listen to people like that because they have political clout. So it's been a long campaign to get the beaver back, and that's the safe option because the beaver is a herbivore. It's not got big fangs and liable to attack sheep or anything. We've also got wild boar back. This is actually on the land that Trees for Life owns. The charity bought 10,000 acres of land in 2008 in Glenmoriston, the next valley south of Glenafric. And we had these boar for a number of years as an experiment. They were actually inside a large fenced exclosure because the area was totally infested by bracken. Bracken is a native species, but it's an opportunistic species, and it has taken over large areas, and I suspect the same is true in Ireland because it's not eaten by deer, it's not eaten by sheep much either because the fronds are toxic, and it then shades out everything else, and it takes over by spreading by rhizomes. So if you pull up a bracken frond, I'm sure some of you have tried that, you just pull it up and you get the stem, and there's nothing at the base of the stem because it snaps off the rhizome, and the rhizome keeps growing and spreading. So we had heard that boar were one of the animals that could solve this problem, because what boar do, as I'm sure you know, they root around in the ground, they expose the soil, they eat bracken rhizomes, which are not as toxic as the fronds are, and the rhizomes that don't get eaten get exposed, and then in the winter frost can kill them and it sets the bracken back. So we tried this as an experiment for a number of years. These boar were donated to us, but ultimately it wasn't successful. We had them in an area of like 1.5 hectares, I think, and 6 boar, and we thought we'd cleared all the bracken. We moved them to another area, and within a year the bracken was back as bad as ever in the first location. So it wasn't a success. We'd had to have probably a commercial pig farm density to get rid of it completely. So that didn't work. So I'm telling you some of the things that work. It's also good to acknowledge things that didn't work. So the way to deal with bracken, I think, is you have to get broad-leafed, large-leaf trees re-established, particularly oak and hazel, where they have large leaves, they create a dense shade, and bracken just dies out under the canopy of those trees. And in fact, I and other people now use the distribution of bracken as an indicator for where we should have oak in our mostly pine-dominated landscapes. So, because bracken is an indicator of better soil, dry soil, it won't live in wet areas. So there's a different approach required there. Okay, just looking at time, need to keep moving here. So ecological relationships and processes I talked about. So this picture on the left here, these are the wood ants I mentioned earlier, and here they're tending aphids on a young aspen tree. And I don't know if many of you know about this. Aphids are one of my particularly fascinating groups. They're a group that's usually got a very bad image for people. Aphids are garden pests and they're hard to get rid of and all that sort of thing. But it's only a few species that become pests. Most are harmless and they live in natural life and they fulfill a role in the ecosystem. They are sap suckers. So they have a proboscis called a rostrum that they insert into the stem of a plant or a tree, and they suck the sap. And they then secrete a waste liquid which is called honeydew. And for many species, the honeydew is highly attractive to ants. And the ants come and they actually literally farm the aphids. So they tend them, they protect them from predators, because if you think, if you're an aphid, you've got your rostrum stuck into a plant, and if a bird comes along, it's hard to get out and escape, you know. So the ants protect them from predators, and it's well known that they actually pick the aphids up sometimes and move them from one place to another. So they are literally farming these aphids. And that relationship is crucial because the ants have an important role in the forest beyond that. And that's really good to see that relationship re-established. As soon as trees begin to grow, aphids appear. The winged variety, the winged forms of them can travel long distances because they're so light. And then this is another relationship that happened with our wild boar. This is a cold winter we had the year after we got the boar. It's unusual to get so much snow these days, but you can see here, this is a robin sitting at almost as close to the boar as it could get, waiting for the boar to move on and hoping that there might be a worm that the boar has missed that it can grab out of the ground. So this is a well-known phenomenon in mainland Europe where boar have never been wiped out, that they are followed by certain birds that take advantage of the boar's disturbance function. So again, disturbance is really important. I've talked about this already. This is the relationship between pine martens and squirrels. So these photographs are from Laurie Campbell, a Scottish photographer. Most of the images are mine, but I don't have good ones of these species. So pine martens, where they've returned here in Ireland and also now in Scotland, they opportunistically or preferentially prey on the grey squirrel from North America because it comes from a habitat, a landscape where there's no equivalent predator to the pine marten. So they've not evolved in the presence of the pine marten. And they're bigger, the grey squirrels, they're bigger and heavier than the reds. The reds are more agile and they can get out to the end of small branches where pine martens can't go. So when pine martens return, they will prey on grey squirrels, and the grey squirrels tend to move out of those areas, allowing the reds to recolonize then. So that's a great example of using a natural process and a native species to help the recovery of the healthy ecosystem. So we've also been involved at Trees for Life in the translocation of squirrels because the native forest in Scotland is so fragmented. And if you think back to the map, I showed the black blobs where the Caledonian pine woods are. Some of them, especially in the Northwest Highlands, they're very isolated. They're small and there's many kilometers of treeless land between them. And most of those remnants have lost their squirrels historically. And squirrels will not spread over large areas of treeless ground because they're vulnerable to predation by birds. So we started a project some years ago in which we were catching squirrels, red squirrels, in areas where they were abundant around the Murray Firth area where I live, around Inverness, and translocating them, releasing them into these squirrelless woodlands in the Northwest Highlands of Scotland. Because the squirrels have an important function within the forest. They help to disperse seeds, by caching pine cones and acorns, and they never find them all and they grow in new places. So that's been very successful. The program is still going. I'm not part of Trees for Life. I haven't been for nearly 5 years, but that program is still well underway. And many new areas of squirrel population have been established in these old isolated fragments of woodland. The next step, which has not happened yet, of course, is getting the predators back. And a lot of attention is focused on the wolf, but actually, the near-term prospect is much more likely to be the lynx. The lynx does not come with all the cultural baggage that is associated with the wolf. The wolf has been demonized for centuries in our culture. We all grow up with fairy tales and children's stories of the big bad wolf and Little Red Riding Hood. And then when we're teenagers, we might go and watch werewolf movies in the cinema. It all serves to demonize this animal. So there's a huge cultural obstacle there. And because wolves go around in packs, they're perceived as threatening. So there's a huge cultural obstacle there. That doesn't exist with the lynx. The lynx is a solitary animal. There's no fairy tales about the big bad lynx. There's no Hollywood films about the ferocious lynxes. So it's much more innocuous and it's an easier bet. So I'm hoping that we'll get lynx back in Scotland in the next 5 to 10 years. There's quite a lot of people advocating it right now, and lynx have spread naturally throughout much of mainland Europe since the collapse of communism and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fences that separated East and West Europe. And there's now been both lynx and wolf seen in countries like the Netherlands, densely populated, so they've spread substantially, and people are living with them. And that's what we need to learn to do again. We need to learn to live with these animals because they fulfill a crucial role in the ecosystem. They are the apex predators which help to maintain the food web, the food pyramid. Okay, this is, probably shouldn't have put this in, just I don't think you can see it very clearly, but what it says here is a scientific research paper published on the 15th of June, which is just a couple of weeks ago, makes the case that based on the proven result of pine marten recovery in Ireland, reducing the prevalence of non-native grey squirrels, the reintroduction of lynx to Ireland would similarly lead to a reduction in non-native sika deer numbers. So the top chart here is showing the effect of the pine marten, and this is showing what's likely to be the effect of reintroducing lynx. So that's a paper. If anybody's interested, you can copy down the link to it later, and it's specific to Ireland. So this is not from Scotland. This is research that's been done here in Ireland. So it would be great to get lynx back in Ireland too. And I don't know if there's much of a caucus promoting that at the moment or not, but some of the research has been done. So nearly at the end now, just to summarize then, there's a set of principles of restoration that I've developed over the years of doing this work, which are generic principles which I believe can be applied anywhere. I've shown you some examples of them specific to the Caledonian forest. They're in many cases very obvious and simple things, but they're profound in their implications. So number one, work from areas of strength. Start from where you've got as much of the ecosystem as possible. So that's why I started in Glenafric, where we had the old pine forest, where there were all those trees, the 100,000 pine seedlings I referred to. It makes sense to start from there rather than a treeless landscape where you're going to have to raise trees in the nursery and plant them and so forth. So start from areas of strength. That's utilizing a natural process, because if humans got out of the way, that's how nature would recover. That's what's happened in Norway. Pay attention to keystone species, those on which many others depend. So I've referred to wood ants as a keystone species. The European beaver is a keystone species in riparian and lochside ecosystems. And Scots pine is a keystone species in the Caledonian forest because it's the largest and longest lived tree, and it provides the framework, the structure for so many other things that live within and underneath it. So focus on those. Number three, re-establish ecological processes such as the use of pioneer species, so focus on birch and rowan, things like that, for example, where there's no trees left, and natural succession to facilitate the restoration process. Number four, mimic nature wherever possible. And this is something I always emphasize when I'm working with volunteers who are planting trees, because it's quite a challenge. We go out to areas where trees are regenerating naturally and show them, look for these vegetation communities, look at the distribution. Don't be afraid to plant trees, 30 centimeters apart sometimes, but also leave big gaps of 5-10 meters, because that's how nature does it. Don't plant in straight lines. Don't plant in regular spacing. It's surprisingly difficult to do that. Mimic nature wherever possible. Recreate ecological niches where they've been lost. So that's things like leaving dead wood in a forest, because most places dead wood, oh, we'll take that out, we can make a bench out of it, or we can burn it in a fire and get some heat. But actually the dead wood is vital because it's the recycling center of the forest, and there's a whole suite of organisms that are associated with dead wood, and if you take that away, they've got no place to live, and you're also removing nutrients. So recreate ecological niches like that where they've been lost. Re-establish ecological linkages. Reconnect the threads in the web of life. And here's another example. This is again an ant, a different ant. This is a red ant, not a wood ant, and it's tending aphids on an eared willow. So that's one of those ecological relationships. And the ants might be fed on by birds in turn. Number 7, control and or remove introduced non-native species. So that's the rhododendron. For us, we've done a lot of work also felling Sitka spruce and other non-native trees in places like Glenafric, because the Forestry Commission, who manage most of it, planted some of those in the past. And their policy now is to get rid of them all, so we're helping with that process. It's dealing with grey squirrels and so forth as well. Number 8. remove or mitigate the limiting factors which prevent rewilding or restoration from taking place naturally. So in our case in Scotland, that's primarily the huge imbalance of far too many herbivores. Deer and in some cases sheep, although sheep are not such an issue in many of the areas that we've been working in because for financial reasons, you know, they're just not out there anymore. It was a loss-making venture and people are not into that. So find out what the limiting factors are, because restoration should occur. It's a spontaneous, natural process, and it's human actions that block it. So if you can identify what those key factors are and address those, in this case either by fencing or by reducing deer numbers, then you get the process happening spontaneously. Number 9, pay special attention to species with limited ability to disperse. So I've got here aspen, wood ants and twinflower. Aspen is a native tree in the forest in Scotland, and you've got it in Ireland here, but in Scotland, I don't know if it's the same in Ireland, but in Scotland it rarely flowers and it very rarely sets seed. And aspen's main method of reproduction is sending up suckers off its root system, off what are called ramets. And it will do that very vigorously, but aspen is highly palatable to deer, so they'll eat it before anything else. So what that means is that if aspen is cleared from an area, it will never come back because there's no seeds. So we started a program many years ago of digging up aspen suckers and root sections, propagating those in a nursery, and then introducing aspen to areas where it could not recover by itself. Wood ants, there's been some work done on translocation of wood ants, not Trees for Life, but other people have done that, because again, wood ants, when the winged ants appear in midsummer, they have a flight dispersal distance of something like 100 or 150 meters. And they won't spread beyond that. So if you've got an isolated woodland with no wood ants, they're not likely to get back of their own accord. Twinflower, another native plant in our forest. Again, it rarely reproduces by seed. It spreads vegetatively by above ground runners. So there's been some work done on introducing that to areas where it has vanished. Number 10, reintroduce species that are unlikely or impossible to return by themselves. So the lynx again here. Lynx and wolves have spread throughout mainland Europe. They're not going to come to Britain. They won't swim across the English Channel. So if we want them back, we've actually got to physically bring them back. And that's, of course, a bigger issue. Number 11, talked about this before, re-establish ecological processes, the essential ones, predator-prey dynamics and natural disturbance, which are absent. Number 12, very important in my view, let nature do most of the work. So when we've been planting trees, we've not been going out and planting hundreds of hectares. We've been designing relatively small enclosures, 50 hectares maximum usually, in the treeless landscape. Plant trees there with a view to establishing a future seed source. And if we can work with the landowners to get the grazing pressure down in time, fewer hungry mouths and a much greater amount of seed being produced should result in spontaneous successful regeneration outside the fences. So we're effectively kick-starting or catalyzing the natural recovery process, and we want to let nature do most of the work, because nature will do it much better than we humans can do. Number 13, human intervention should be the minimum necessary and designed to be inconspicuous as soon as possible. So again, the way we plant trees, take the fences down when the trees are above browsing height, and just let nature take over. And 14, then, I talked about this last night, the green thumb principle, or the green heart principle, that love has a tangible positive effect on all living things to which it is directed. And this is a labour of love. I think for many people engaged in restoration, it is a labour of love because we love nature and the earth responds to that, and we can accelerate and catalyse it. Okay, just finally then, a couple of other thoughts. Restoration is the work which reconnects. It's obviously the work that reconnects the strands in the thread of life, but crucially also, it's the work which reconnects people with some of the most important qualities that I think are essential for us to live healthy lives as people. So just to summarise, it reconnects us with the rest of nature. If we want to truly engage in restoration rather than the imposition of a tree plantation on a landscape, we need to know the land. We need to understand what's going on there and be sensitive to that. It connects us with place. So the places I've been involved with, you've seen the photograph of me with the champion pine. I've been going there for over 30 years. I know that place like the proverbial back of my hand. It reconnects us with life in a culture that's so focused on death and destruction. That's crucially important. It connects us with each other, people locally, local folks, and also foreigners. These are two women who came from Madagascar to take part in one of our volunteer projects. They were starting up a project in Madagascar, one of the most depleted and biologically impoverished countries on the planet. And they were working in a tree nursery, so they got funding to come to Scotland to experience what we were doing. It connects people with their own power. I said earlier, I think, when I started this, I had no experience, no knowledge, no resources. We've planted 2 million trees. We've got hundreds of hectares of forest recovering. We've got squirrels translocated, and it's not just me, it's a whole team of people that have done that, but I've found my power, I've found my passion, I've made a difference. I gave a TED talk about this a couple of years ago, and it's been viewed by 600,000 people. I've reached all those people with just me, I'm just this one little guy. It reconnects us with healing, because healing is what we're doing. We're healing the landscape, we're healing the ecosystem, and we're part of that, so I experience a healing and a return to wholeness myself. It reconnects us with hope. We desperately need more hope in the world today, because everything, if you look at the mainstream media, it's all going downhill. It's climate change, sixth mass extinction, crime, violence, war, Ukraine, all of that, it can be overwhelming. And people respond very positively to hope. This is a work of hope. I will not be around to see the trees I've planted reach maturity. My great-great-grandchildren hopefully will have that privilege. But that's hope for the future. And it reconnects us with spirit, with passion. And I hope you've had some of my passion today. So restoration provides an opportunity for each of us to make a positive difference in the world. This is the skeleton I showed in one of those previous photographs. And this is the sort of thing we do. We go out there and we stand in a circle, hold hands, close our eyes and just tune in. Imagine that tree when it was alive. Imagine that landscape in 100 years when it's got a new forest growing there. And ground that vision through our practical action, through giving care to the seedlings. This is a woman who's worked, leads some of our conservation weeks and works in our nursery. It's the labour of love, and you can see, the genuine smile there. She really loves what she's doing. So the need for restoration is global. And here's the picture of the planet from space again. Somebody holding a seedling. In this image, I found it many years ago and I've used it a lot, the hands holding the earth, because that, I believe, is what we need. We collectively as humanity need to nourish the planet, hold it, and give Gaia our love. And of course, the need for restoration is local as well. This is the young forest in Scotland. These are the trees that were planted on our first planting week in 1990. You can see they're growing at varying rates. And look at the spacing. You can see there's some dense clusters, but there's big gaps, And the goal there is in 50 years' time, nobody will know that was a planted forest. It will look so varied and diverse. And then this is Killarney National Park, a young rowan tree, a pioneer species growing there, hope for the future. So, thank you very much for your attention.